In this special 100th episode, Golden and I discuss current and future trends in science fiction, fantasy, and superhero entertainment with friend of the show, David Raiklen. Full speed ahead.
The Omega Beam. Full power.
Welcome to the Omega Beam, episode 100. I'm your host, Oren Merton. Did you notice that we have a slightly different theme song now? This is a milestone, our 100th episode. So for those who haven't been following along, the Omega Beam podcast began with a different name with no real focus on anything in particular. And the first episode was listened to by basically a handful of friends that I cajoled into it. But here we are, episode 100. We have Golden as our regular co-host, and we have semi-regular guests. We have a clear focus, and so far, more than 20,000 podcast listens from people all over the globe, from India and Europe and the UK, from the USA, Africa, Australia, Latin America, North America, you name it. So for this episode, I thought it would be fun to talk to friend of the show, David Raiklen, who himself is a producer and composer in the sci-fi world, and have a conversation about where we think things are going. This has been a crazy year, but do we think that this year is going to have a particular lasting resonance in the stories that we read about and that we see on TV and go to the movies? Let's talk about it. I am here with Golden and with David Raiklen for our 100th episode.
Hi, everyone.
So I thought it would be a lot of fun, rather than just do a standard episode talking about a particular show, to kind of, since this is a bit of a milestone, to kind of look forward as far as trends and stories and music and effects and really where we see the future of genre entertainment as far as sci-fi and fantasy superhero stuff. The first question that I have relates to this crazy year we've had. I was listening to Fat Man Beyond, and they had a great guest, Greg Rucka, who is a well-known comic book writer. And he wrote the comic and the screenplay for The Old Guard, which was a great Netflix adaptation of his comic. And he was saying, mostly seriously, that he imagines in the next year or so, we're going to start seeing a lot of Hallmark romantic comedies that are sort of love in the era of COVID. And he was sort of joking, they're going to all be a little on the lame side. How do we think this might play into sci-fi and fantasy and things that aren't about the real world per se?
That's a great question. And, people have already talked about how the Mandalorian is the perfect hero for the time of the pandemic because he never uncovers his face. He always wears a mask in the presence of every living person. So, there's already been a little bit of prescience or with the superhero show The Boys, where the protagonists are corporate superheroes that are reaching out to separate demographics. So, if you're a white Christian, you have your superhero, Starburst or Starlight, and then if you're, like a neo-Nazi, that they have their own superhero. So, I think we're already seeing a little bit of that in the science fiction, fantasy, superhero genre because, the people who create this stuff tend to be the most imaginative and who are looking ahead to, what has never been done before, what could be happening around the corner. I think that the idea that we'll have romantic comedies about this. We'll have to see how, is this too soon to have
Yeah.
a COVID romantic comedy?
It'll just take place on another planet or in a galaxy far, far away.
Yes. That could do it. That could make it more acceptable. I'm sure that, 10 years from now, they'll definitely be doing romantic comedies when people will be looking back and thinking, how could those people back then have been so crazy? We can make fun of them.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because one of the series that was on Amazon that I watched not that long ago, we very much enjoyed, called Upload.
Yeah.
With Robbie Amell
Mhm.
playing a character who dies and is uploaded to their cloud heaven. And what was interesting is when they were showing the real world in public transportation, people taking buses and things, that this was filmed pre-pandemic, and yet they still had people in masks in the show on trains and buses and things like that. So someone there must have, because this was obviously, we clearly had things like Ebola, and in Asia, they're much less finicky about wearing masks in public and had been for many years. So someone who worked on Upload obviously looked at that and said, this may be something we do in the future. And of course, I'm sure they had no idea that they were exactly right, that everybody was going to be wearing masks in the future. But I wonder if we're going to be seeing something like that, if science fiction and fantasy writers are going to look at what the world is like today, extrapolate forward, like you said, and sort of be early, if you will, about what's going to end up happening in the future.
The stay at home, triggered a lot of people going to a lot of movies that had to do with pandemics, or series that had a lot to do with pandemics.
Yes. I remember, back towards the beginning of the shutdown, and was it April, that people were talking about movies like Contagion and all that,
Yeah.
and interviewing the people and saying, "Hey, did you guys foresee 2020 back when you made that, 30 years ago?" It's like, well, no, it's just a coincidence.
Yeah, I remember. God, I hope I don't get the name wrong. I think the movie was called Outbreak. It was Dustin Hoffman, Cuba Gooding Jr.
Yeah,
that's
all-star
a long time
cast.
ago.
Yeah, and I remember in that one, they wrapped it up so nicely with a bow. It's like they found kind of the monkey at patient 0,
Mhm.
and they were able to make a total vaccine and eliminate the virus in like no time by the end of the film.
There was a movie that we ended up watching that Oren, I think you hadn't seen it in a very, very long time. Or you hadn't seen the entire thing, 12 Monkeys.
Oh, right. 12 Monkeys. I'd only seen pieces of it.
Yeah,
over
he'd
time.
only seen pieces of it. So I was like, well, I haven't watched that in a while. Let's watch it. I always think it's very interesting that my first time ever seeing it was in Nazareth, in a theater in Nazareth.
Wow.
In Israel in 1996. I thought, that was, and then going and visiting Megiddo, and, that's where the apocalypse is supposed to happen, at Megiddo.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all of that. So it was a very interesting dichotomy right there between those two things. And 12 Monkeys is basically virus, pandemic. And them in the future trying to figure out how could we go back and get it to not happen.
Yeah, how can we time travel backwards? It is interesting to think of what people. I can imagine all kinds of ways people might want to deal with it, from ignoring it completely and pretending just 2020 didn't happen, or the opposite, or trying to make fantasy and science fiction where they use sort of the wish fulfillment of fiction to express how they think it should have been handled.
Yes. It's sort of like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where the real world events are realistically recreated with a completely fictional outcome.
Right, where Quentin Tarantino gets to tell you this is how I wished it went.
There was a Netflix series a while back. I guess it was all the way back in 2014, called Helix.
Yeah.
I know there's probably no chance that Oren ever saw it.
Because it was horror?
It was slightly horror, very gory at times. But I don't think it only went for 2 seasons. But it was, following a team of scientists from the CDC and CDC and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention who traveled to a research facility in the Antarctic.
Yeah.
In the Arctic.
That show happened several years ago and ran for several seasons, and it got a new lease on life when people discovered it, back in April. I mean, I remember it went on Amazon, and they were very careful to somehow leave off the year that it was produced in. And it was current enough that it really looked like that. Wow, these guys! How could they do a show about the pandemic so quickly? It's amazing.
Yeah, no, it was a very interesting series.
Yeah. So we're talking about the pandemic. I also think a lot of the issue, which is tied to the pandemic because of how it all played out in the world, but I think part of it is also going to be interesting to see how future writers capture the way in which political leadership handles things like this. I think in most fiction that I've seen in the past, either the conspiracy theory, we can't let it out that we actually made this as a bioweapon, like Outbreak and all the rest, or it's been, oh my God, this is terrible, and everyone's working together to solve it and to save everyone, or going to a planet where there's a pandemic and everybody wants to cure it. But it's interesting now because we've seen in our own world that every nation has handled this completely differently, from nations that were completely on top of it, using the best science available, did incredible for their people, to nations that literally denied it and have been out of control ever since. So I wonder how that is going to find its way.
Well, you already kind of
into
had
fiction.
with like the herd immunity. You have books. I'm not going to say which books, because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. You have books that at a certain age, people like go off to the retirement village or wherever it is. When in fact it's like, oh no, they've hit a certain age, so they go off here, and no one knows that when they go off there, they are actually killed. Because it's the older people aren't worth anything,
right?
And so it's a very interesting. You kind of get that with people that are with herd immunity. They're okay with people that have illnesses that are more susceptible, or the older people that are also more susceptible. It's like okay if they die.
Right.
Well, that's simply brutal and uncivilized. Yeah, there was a time when societies were like that. And that's, when in order to get food, that, you'd have to go out and kill the cow. And that would be you killing the cow personally, because all the people who want to go back to that age think that they're going to be the masters instead of the slaves, but that isn't going to be the way it works at all.
Right. You find yourself where you find yourself, not where you want to be. Absolutely.
Right. So yeah, I mean, that idea of herd immunity, that doesn't really work on populations that number in the millions or billions. That concept works when your herd is a few hundred or 1,000 wildebeest in a limited area, I
think this is also a good jumping off point to talk about storytelling technology, because we already talked about The Mandalorian, and we're at a point where, of course, in the real world, a lot of shows that weren't finished are going to come online later. A lot of movies were pushed back because people can't see them. And it's really going to affect how entertainment can be filmed in the future. And something like The Mandalorian which either has already started shooting season 3 or is going to momentarily. Something like The Mandalorian is perfect because not just because most everyone's in a mask and so they can just have their characters masked up in their stormtrooper masks or Mandalorian masks, but also because since everything is contained in an LCD screen studio, they can have a very minimal crew and completely close the environment.
They
So
can
they
make
really
it very
can
safe.
quarantine.
When after college and I started trying to do some digital art training to maybe make digital environments for games or movies and things like that, I was applying to a lot of game companies. And I had one of them tell me, like, this is a little bit too high end for what we do in games. And I think that that's very ironic now, considering what they're using for The Mandalorian is something that was developed for games.
Oh, yeah. They used the Unity engine on set to allow the director and the DP to previs the shot in real time, which is...
Is it? I think it's the Unreal Engine.
My bad. You're correct. It is Unreal.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. It's absolutely amazing.
First of all, the size of the space itself is a full-on soundstage. It's like 100 feet long. And that's already a big space. And then when you add the highly detailed LED backdrop to give it the sky and off into the stars and infinity, it really does look and feel like you're out of doors. Not like you're in VR out of doors, but like you're in real out of doors.
Yeah, that's what they're saying in the extra thing for The Mandalorian, is that it's nice because the actors can actually look around and point. They don't have to imagine where something is. Oh, it's right there. And it is right there.
Yes.
And if they need to change something, they just change it.
Right. Well, everybody else was and is with very good reasons slowing down and taking their time. The Mandalorian season 2 started shooting in July, and by the end of October, they had already premiered, their first episode. So it seems like they've actually sped up their process.
And of course, we'll talk later after the entire Mandalorian series is done. But if the whole series is like that first episode we just saw,
this season,
yeah, it was something special.
I don't want to give away too much, except that it seems like they are really going to town with what's possible with the technology and creating all kinds of locations.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in the special we were seeing, Jon Favreau was talking about how once they got it to where they really were happy with it, then they were like, okay, well, we can start doing special effects in camera this way. And so it really gives, like Golden was saying, it gives the actors so much to work with, because no longer are they in a green room imagining something. Now it's there. It's just fantastic.
And they can build the sets within the actual soundstage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still have the background, and then you also have
stage.
They're talking about the fact that the light from the actual, like they could have a 12-hour dawn. They could have light actually bouncing off of their set pieces like they normally would outside.
Most of our lighting has, at least if we want to, been transitioned to LEDs. And, you may remember when a 100-watt light bulb got replaced by a much smaller LED. Well, that technology is, even more advanced now, and they have the highest end. So that wall of 1 million LEDs is really like it's bright as daylight.
Yeah, and talking about the future of genre entertainment,
and it's not just them.
Moment, at this moment, those walls are too expensive for all but big budget shows. But I'm sure that as time goes on, we're going to see this more and more.
Yes.
I think it's going to make genre entertainment specifically. It's not like you can only use this if you're doing fantasy or science fiction or whatever, but I think it's so perfect for those genres because they are creating unreal worlds. Whereas you can walk outside and go to a cafe and that's there, you can do that. You can't just walk out into a medieval castle or a space station. But now you kind of can.
Yes. Pinewood, Atlanta, the soundstage is most famous for the Marvel movies,
Mm-hmm.
have already started building their own LED surround capture space. And so I think you're right that it's going to be the high-end productions that are going to do this first, but the cost will come down. And the other thing is that, it doesn't have to be 70 feet by 100 feet. I mean, you can make a much smaller LED video wall that's still really cool. Just like, there's cyclorama green screens that, you can put an airplane in. I mean, a real airplane.
Yeah, yeah.
But then there's also little green screens that you can just put behind yourself on Zoom. So,
yeah.
I think those smaller ones will probably start coming out, available to the public for maybe 4 figures in a couple of years. That would be my guess. Oh, and I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I just wanted to mention that about 12 years ago, it was considered revolutionary, really innovative, to have a visual effects person from post-production actually on the set talking to the director and the cinematographer about where they wanted the visual effects. Just having one guy on the set. Now, 12 years later, less than 12 years later, the entire set is taken over by the visual effects department.
Yeah, and it's funny. I remember years ago having a friend of mine who's a director telling me how many things that we don't necessarily think about, even in non effects heavy productions, that are done in post via CG, because he specialized in color correction and changing day to night for things like that. And a lot of times they would just film a night scene in the middle of the day because they just had much more control.
Yes, that's actually been around for years. It's called day for night. And they even did it back in the 1940s, although not as well.
Yeah.
And, there's actually some funny stories about that, in Hollywood history, where this is a little bit of a side mission, but films that were going to travel internationally, they would shoot in English during the day and then in Spanish or some other language at night. So that way they would have everything, be the same.
That's actually a great segue to something else I wanted to talk about. So our world is global. We are at the point now where on Netflix, you can see all kinds of movies in all kinds of languages, no matter where in the globe you are. So, we Americans are notoriously unfriendly to subtitled movies, and yet Netflix is loaded with them. And movies from India, and movies from Europe, and movies from Asia, and even Hollywood movies these days, the Marvel movies, the sci-fi movies, they depend on Asian box office to make their numbers. So how do we see the globalization of movies, and specifically in our genre, how do we see that affecting it?
It's not just that, it's just when are movies going to be back in theaters?
Theaters are, of course, a big thing too.
Well, let's do the globalization first, and then because that's something we know more about, and then we can get into the speculation part. Because a good example of how important this change has been is the Fast and Furious series. The Fast and Furious series is making more money than it ever has before. In other words, as the series goes on, instead of, as one might expect, the interest going down, no, the interest has actually gone up because they've gotten better and better at making them nonverbal and playing for, different audiences. So now it used to be that the Fast and the Furious franchise made 2/3 of its money in the United States. Now, just within that one franchise, they make 2/3 of their box office globally. So that's kind of what's happening. And there's there's a reason why American film culture is so influential around the world. And that's because Americans have always preferred to have things shown than said. Dialogue-heavy movies and TV shows tend to not do well in America. So by keeping the amount of dialogue low and the amount of action high, we were perfectly set to not only go to a global market, but to dominate the global market, because other cultures aren't so visual. They're more verbal. They have characters with more dialogue in their shows. So when they try and make a movie that travels, that's the term of art, is that it travels to different locations, they have a much harder time of it. Like Luc Besson is someone that comes to mind, but there aren't many other people I can think of that do blockbuster movies that come from other non-English speaking cultures, right? I mean,
and then you have an article that came out last week, and it might have been out longer than that, about the fact that someone was speculating, well, why is Jackie Chan not making movies anymore? And he's just not making American movies because he wanted more serious roles, and people in America aren't taking him seriously. He wants more dramatic roles.
Yes. Well, he's going back to, he had a great career as a Hong Kong action star, right? I mean, before the Rush Hour movies, or, a few years before that, he was not big box office here. Now, that he's a star, people go back and they look at his early movies and they go, wow, this guy was incredible, and he was...
I love him in Cannonball Run.
I think in some ways,
because really,
genre fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, superhero really lends itself, like you were saying, to traveling, not just because of the action, but I think that the CG and the great the unreal, let's say, environments, because they don't necessarily have a direct cultural bias to them necessarily. If you're in space, that can be exciting no matter where you are, because it's not saying anything specifically against your country or against a particular political party that you don't like. It's fiction. It's completely out there. And I think that because fantasy, science fiction, because they use allegory, because they tell stories about what's happening in the human condition with non-humans or off-planet, I think that allows cultures that maybe don't want to open themselves up, whether maybe not the people, but where the governments may not want to necessarily open themselves up to criticism. It will allow those movies through that don't necessarily look on the surface like they're criticizing anything on Earth.
Right. Well, that's sort of been the role of science fiction and fantasy for a very long time. I mean, it took me a while to understand that War of the Worlds is about imperialism.
Yeah.
Because it's so well done, it immerses you in this alternative world that you don't necessarily need to think about what the inspiration of that universe is. He just builds this world and the characters inhabit it, and you just accept that.
And speaking of what science fiction, fantasy, all the rest can do, one of the things that Star Trek in particular, I'm going to shine a golden light on Star Trek, but not just Star Trek, have done is they've, in a sense, tried to lead the way with, I guess you'd call it utopian science fiction, that it tends to show us a vision of a future that maybe isn't realistic in the way that Blade Runner attempted to capture, a dystopian Los Angeles, but it's a future that we want, even if it's not maybe the one that we're headed towards. Do you think that the current state of the world being very unutopian will make that seem quaint and less interesting? Or do you think it will, in fact, make it more relevant than ever because we need that aspiration? We need to look at those things.
Absolutely convinced that we need and will get more utopian science fiction. The precedent is World War II. It was right around the time of World War II that utopian science fiction was in its golden age in literature. And then when the Vietnam War was happening, that's when Star Trek was happening on television. So the really good artists understand that people need aspirational heroes that aren't necessarily someone that anybody could actually be, but you can move in that direction.
I think, I agree. I think Star Trek is perfect for that. I think, we've kind of gotten at the moment, at least, well, especially in the DC universe, all their heroes have to be dark and gritty and troubled. But I think that one of the great strengths of Superman is that he is aspirational. He does what's right because it's right, and he fights for what's good because it's good. In the Marvel universe, they kind of gave that role to Captain America, and I think he handles it brilliantly. I would love to see DC, give Superman that mantle again.
I agree. But we're talking about a long, recurring discussion about the direction of DC. And they just don't have a lot of humor or pure goodness in any of their shows. And
I hope that's changing.
That's kind of been a directive from the very top. So it doesn't matter whether it's the comics or the TV shows or whatever. I do think that Berlanti Productions have done a good job of lightening up DC a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Not to make a play
Although
on
some of the
Black
shows
Lightning.
are really, like Riverdale and a couple of the others are still very dark.
Yes, they are. And I think, again, that is sort of the default, the place that they're starting from.
And that's interesting because that's coming from a very light-hearted Archie comics. If you go back and you listen to the radio shows, they're very
silly.
light.
They're not.
They're
dark
very
and serious.
airy. And then someone asked me once, well, why did they just make new characters instead of taking Archie and the gang? And my comment is, well, because people know Archie. They're familiar with that name, and it started them into the series.
Right. Well,
it got them in there.
If you want to have someone to blame for that, and I'm not saying that we should have someone to blame for that, or that this person necessarily deserves any blame, but that whole trend actually started with Steven Spielberg. With Jaws, because Jaws made more money in its first weekend than most hit movies made in their entire run. And this completely blew the minds of studio executives because they, were always concerned about how they can make a profit. And now in one weekend, we can make as much money as it used to take us months. So that started them on this path of having to open big. And in order to open big, there has to be a lot of recognition value. You can't have a giant, world-dominating product if no one's heard of it before.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Hence, everything is a sequel.
I thought it was very interesting. And I know Archie's not necessarily science fiction.
Right, but we talked about Berlanti, so it makes It fits.
He took characters and re-envisioned them in a very different way. And they still have aspects of those original characters, but they have more layers. And a lot of the characters from the radio show are very cookie cutter, not very multi-layered, multi-dimensional. And these characters did.
Yes.
So I thought it was a very nice take on it, very different take.
Well, I have...
It does tie into Sabrina, so that's kind of.
Yeah.
I think that it's fine to reimagine characters. I mean, I'm certainly used to it. I grew up reading comics, and, every few years, sometimes more frequently, there'd be a new writer or a new artist or both on a book. And so it's the, quote, same character, except that it's not the same character. They've been reimagined, sometimes in profound ways,
And then the
like Batman was not the Dark Knight. For 40 plus years, Batman was closer to being a Superman, paragon of good detective, and he didn't have all this dark angst and grittiness. That all happened in one series that had a big impact in the 80s, and even the first Batman movies were much less dark than the Christopher Nolan ones. So that's definitely a transformation of reimagining. And I don't know if it's for the better. I think it works for Batman. I don't think it works for Superman.
Yeah, and the truth is I think if you look at the cartoons, and obviously there was the Batman the Animated Series, which was a gigantic hit and really set the tone for animation.
Yes.
For a very long time. In general, even in Batman the Animated Series, but especially in later series, even there Batman started lightening up and having more of a life, and you started getting the quote unquote Bat family more involved.
And you didn't watch the Batman Beyond,
right? I did not.
Where he's a very serious character, and the young kids trying to get him to lighten up. So yeah.
Speaking of this is also a nice segue to another thing I wanted to get into. One of the criticisms of the current state of not just genre entertainment, just big budget entertainment in general, but specifically genre entertainment, is that everything is a franchise or it's being a reboot or something like that. Do we see that continuing? I mean, where do we see sort of original material?
I think that it's... Yeah, I mean, I think that especially with Netflix and other places out there, look at Raised by Wolves. I don't think I've ever seen anything like Raised by Wolves before. And I keep thinking, okay, this is where it's going to go. And I'm not caught up yet. I haven't finished watching it. And I'm like, wow, it didn't go there. It went somewhere completely different. And it also surprised me talking about what's happening on TV versus what's happening in the world, is one of the characters says to another, put the gun down. Violence is not the way. The character's life is being threatened. And the character's telling another character, no, do not do violence on my account. It's not worth it. Non-violence. Give up the gun. And it's especially in this day and age with a lot maybe happening this next week, with a lot of talk about people are scared. There might be a lot of violence next week. It's such a poignant exchange in this science fiction show.
Yeah, well, science fiction is about people. Fantasy is about people. Now, it's also got an expanded definition of people. People can be dragons, or they can be elves, or they can be aliens. And that's partly a attempt to go beyond what's in our day-to-day lives, but it's also a way to cast the characters in a way that removes them from the negativity or the stereotypes.
Yeah.
Right. So you can have a strong female in the future, and an alien, And that was more acceptable than having a female action hero that was set in present day. And, now we're getting more female action heroes that are set in the present day. But, it became acceptable by first showing it happening in the future on another planet.
Yeah, so do we see the studios and Netflix and everyone else opening their purses to original stories?
Yes, as long as it's a really successful original story from another medium.
I see. So we'll still be using comics and novels and things as the basis.
Oh yeah, look, they have the gold mine of all gold mines with the DC and especially the Marvel universe. They had no idea when they bought that what they were getting. I mean, for a few $1 million, they got a few $1 billion back within just 10 years. So
sure,
1,000-fold return on investment. That's pretty good for starters.
That's a good buy.
I mean, it's hard to imagine that because when people are thinking of large numbers, they tend to kind of blur together. But it's sort of like imagine that Marvel, that Disney bought Marvel for $1, and now that dollar is worth $1,000. Well, that would be a really good deal, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's just a million times bigger than that. And I think that the expanded universe is going to be coming to Netflix soon with the Millerverse. Mark Miller.
The Millerverse.
The shows have been slow in development, but he seems very positive about it. And he's not one to sugarcoat things that I've seen. If things are going well, he says so. If they're not going well, he says so. Or he says nothing.
Yeah.
I think that they are, that Netflix is planning on launching several Mark Miller shows over a course of a season or two or a year or two, and have them be interconnected and basically become a parallel superhero verse to Marvel and DC that's only available on Netflix.
Sounds good. Yeah. Speaking of fantasy, I was watching something late last night talking about Amazon's purchase of the rights to do a television show from Middle-earth. And I guess the way that their deal was, or not the deal, but their schedule was structured, the showrunners of the Lord of the Rings series wrote, I guess, season 1. They cast it, and then they were going to film the first 2 episodes, stop, and then Amazon and the Tolkien estate were going to look at them, get back to them with their thoughts, etc. And what this show, and of course it's filming in New Zealand, go figure, and what this show pointed out is people have been very optimistic and very positive about it. It's not a prequel or sequel to the Lord of the Rings movies or any of that. Middle-earth is this gigantic history. Tolkien literally wrote an entire world history that spans thousands and thousands of years. So this all takes place 1,000 years before Lord of the Rings. It's its own thing. And from what this video is saying, the estate was very happy. Amazon was very happy, and so they already greenlit season 2 with only 2 shows of season 1 filmed, and now I guess they're continuing to shoot the rest of season 1.
Yeah, well, sometimes you get lightning in a bottle, and they certainly had terrific source material, to expand on, because you're right, Tolkien created a much vaster world than he himself could explore, partly because, he kept his day job.
Yeah, it should be interesting, though, because we're talking a lot about TV. And going back to the big screen,
yes,
we still don't know when any of that. I know a lot of people very excited about Wonder Woman 84. I know a lot of people that were really, really excited to see what Denis Villeneuve does with Dune.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully I pronounced his name right. and we don't know. We're gonna have to wait an entire year now for Dune at least. Who knows about Wonder Woman? And okay, do we just rent out a theater?
Yes.
And take our 12 friends?
I say yes. I'm all for it. $99 to rent the theater, even if it's $199 to rent the theater with 10 other people. I'm down to see Wonder Woman 84 if they release it.
Yeah, I mean, if it's like, okay, what are they going to do with theaters?
The only thing I'm going to insist is that
end up restructuring theaters so that the theaters are actually smaller and they're only going to house like 50 people with a giant screen. So the screen just seems bigger because your seat is closer. I mean, it's interesting. I mean,
it is an interesting thing to think about because, like you were saying, if there's less people in seats, that also means they'd probably raise the price.
Yeah, but they're doing that anyway. I mean, I that's something that I really am not that happy about. That I like IMAX, but do I really want to pay $25 a seat? If I go with somebody else, that's $50 plus, the snacks. So now it's up to $70 plus parking. That's $80.
Years ago, I said if I was ever on the fence about a movie, it's like I didn't go to see the newer Blade Runner movie in the theater. Mm-hmm. I figure if I'm going to go see it, I'd probably go and spend $20 on my ticket. If I wait for it to come out on DVD, I'm going to get the digital copy, the DVD, and it costs me an additional $5. But I can watch it again. So
I love seeing movies in the theater. And if there's even two strong elements in the movie, and I'm talking about if it just has a wonderful set design and a wonderful score, then I'll feel like I got my money's worth seeing it on the big screen with the big sound system. Or if there's a really great
we were very happy that we got a chance.
The best actors, at least in my opinion, the best film actors look better on the big screen. Their performance is tailored or nuanced for them to be 30 feet tall instead of, whatever it is, the vertical on your TV screen. 27
we lucked
inches.
out before the stay at home and got to see Onward in the theater. And I was very thrilled that we got to see that in the theater because it was such a fabulous movie. And I felt sad that other people weren't going to get to share that experience. I was glad that they brought it to digital or DVD or on demand much quicker. But it was sad that it was robbed, that so many people were robbed of that experience.
It's interesting that you mentioned Onward. I agree with everything you said, and because it is a Pixar animated movie, when you see it on the big screen, it really looks like a movie, a larger than life fantasy, huge experience. And when you see it on TV, even if you have a great TV, there's that part of it that still just feels like a cartoon. You're just watching a cartoon on TV.
That's because it's in a box.
The theaters.
That's because it's in a box, and you can see the box that it's in. If you're watching something in IMAX, then you can't see the edge of the box. You're
not focused on the edge.
Yeah.
And the same, the sound in a movie theater, in a tuned movie theater, is better than is possible to get in a home theater system, unless you've put hundreds of thousands of dollars and created an actual movie theater in your home. And people do that.
So I think it's safe to say that everybody involved with the Omega Beam wants to see theaters and big screen movies continue
safely
in a big way. Yeah, absolutely safely.
Yeah, I mean, we had joined the AMC A-list thing, which was like $25 a month. Actually, I think it started at 20.
It started at 20.
And then it went up to 25, and that was 3 movies a week.
Yeah.
And that was a steal. I mean, honestly, I think that paying, I don't even know what it is for Amazon Prime anymore, actually. Mm-hmm. But paying the let's say, just pretend $130 for free shipping and all of the digital content that they provide you with.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised that we're not paying $200 a year because there's so much there.
Well, part of it is economy of scale.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the issue with movies is economy of scale. That if you're going to make every movie be a $200 million blockbuster. And that is the direction that the big studios have been going in forever. They still do, well, not forever, but for the whole 21st century, they've been going in the direction of making bigger, more expensive movies that are in more theaters at the same time to get an economy of scale. And do you remember when Marvel was being really daring and they released 2 Marvel movies in the same calendar year? 2! Now they're planning on releasing 5 plus TV shows. So people really love those characters in a way that goes beyond any one experience. It's not about, well, I really love that first Avengers movie. Well, I actually really love all the Avengers movies. And
right.
I want to see more of those characters. I don't want to wait years to see what happens next to them. I want, extensions of that universe. And, that's happening with TV shows. I mean, we've already talked about the biggest example of that, the $1 billion TV show. I remember when that deal came down and, I was talking to my friends in the business. It's like, this seems like it's kind of like insane. I mean, the budget for a big TV show, for a whole season, when Netflix paid $150 million to produce a season, or was it 2 seasons of House of Cards, that was considered just mind-boggling that anyone would even think of doing that. It was the unspoken thought was they're going to lose their shirts. They're crazy to do this.
You talk about, I don't know how much they paid for it, but when they first started original programming, one of the first ones they did was Hemlock Grove. I think that was, I don't know if it was based on a book or anything else, but it was original programming. It was a very different take on the vampires and werewolves type thing. You had a Skarsgård in it. I mean, it was a very different series.
Yeah.
And I know that's another one that you never saw.
That is another one I never saw.
And you'll never probably see it because it was definitely a little gory.
Right.
I mean, it had Bill Skarsgård, Famke Johnson, two decent names. Dougray Scott. So, and that was back in, looking at the year. Now I can't find the year.
Yeah, that was Eli Roth, who did a lot of horror movies.
Yes.
And a House with a Clock on its walls, which was a great non-horror movie.
But it went 33 episodes.
Well,
and it is based on a book.
2013.
33 episodes.
They found something that was interesting and ran with it.
Well, now series have 8 or 10 episodes. That again, that's such a huge change. Used to be the TV shows are about having a new episode every week for like at least 6 months. I mean, at least 26 episodes.
And it's not locked into every single episode has to be 40 minutes. It's okay. If we need 54 minutes, then we're going to use 54 minutes. If we need 38 minutes, this episode's going to be 38 minutes. And I think that really speaks to quality over quantity. I know we're sitting here on the edge of our seats. I got my aunt to get caught up on Lucifer. And she's like, but there's going to be more, right? And I'm like, yes, there's going to be more. We finished, and I think I put off watching it because I knew that I'd want more with Doom Patrol. And then we got to the end. It was like they didn't get to finish the season.
They were shut down.
No!
Yes.
So I think that it definitely put the industry at an odd stopping point for so many shows not being able to at least finish the storyline that they were on.
Yes. Well, and I do think that movies will come back, but I do see that there is a real risk that people, say, under 20 are not going to have as much exposure to movies as it takes, movies in the theater, to get into the habit of doing it because they have many other options, and because of the shutdown, and because of the rising prices. So that's something I'm really concerned about in the future, is how can we make sure that good family movies are accessible to kids and or teenagers.
Sure.
I saw a friend of mine. They rented out the theater and they took the kids and a couple of their friends to go see Hocus Pocus.
Okay, that sounds like a fun day.
Yeah.
I mean, they're bringing in. I think Empire Strikes Back is currently in the theater right now.
Yeah.
There's just this odd collection of movies that are in the theaters right now.
Hey, I've just rediscovered my love of drive-ins.
There we go. Back to the drive-ins.
Yes, the drive-in is coming back.
Have you guys gone to a drive-in this year?
No.
I've been 4 times, and I loved it every time. I saw everything from a science fiction epic to a current issues documentary, and they all played great, and there wasn't a problem. I was hearing the sound through my car stereo speakers.
What's funny is, as an audio junkie, snob, whatever you want to call it, one of the reasons drive-ins don't appeal is I don't have the greatest car stereo system.
Well,
so I love that, sitting in the theater, huge THX, massive
play
sound.
around with your dials. I mean, that's like one of the first things I do in my car is I adjust how much sound comes from the right or the left, because I know that one of my ears is better than the other, so it's a little bit on the weakest ear, it's a little bit higher on that side, and yeah.
Right. And it depends on the mix of the film. Like, if it's a real surround sound mix where, the spaceships are flying overhead, then you want to have more of the rear speakers.
Yeah, dial up the rear.
Yeah, well, speaking of sound, this brings me to another subject I wanted to cover. So,
cool.
We've talked about the visuals and the stories. So how do we think that soundtrack music might evolve over time? I've been really excited about the way music has been going, and I'm going to bring up Ludwig Göransson, who does the music to The Mandalorian, which is picture perfect, how he integrates sort of the Star Wars musical vocabulary along with modern synths and world instrumentation, and just has created something new.
Well, he created something new, but it wasn't for The Mandalorian. It was for the Black Panther.
Right.
That's what got him this gig. And that's one of the great soundtracks of the 21st century. And I love the Mandalorian soundtrack, don't get me wrong. And he's definitely, taking those ideas and extending them even further, because, he's got an even bigger palette. He's got all these episodes and all these different planets to go to. But he really got that sound in the Black Panther, including the traditional Hollywood / John Williams orchestral spectacular sound. And he really wasn't as good at it then as he is now, but that's when he started doing it. Because that's not easy to do. That's way harder to do than people who have never tried it and who are musicians think. They think that, that old-fashioned stuff. Well, it turns out that old-fashioned stuff has all this craftsmanship in it. If it doesn't have all that craftsmanship, it sounds really corny and cheesy. So it has to be really well put together. But still, movies and TV shows are mass entertainment. They can also be mass education, and they can also be, all kinds of other things, information, but they're also mass entertainment. So movies and TV have always had lots of pop music in it. And movies in particular, although more recently also TV, have incorporated every kind of music, from folk music of America to folk music of China, from pop music of America to pop music of India. And sometimes, the same movie will have those different genres all in the same thing, something that would never happen outside of the movie. Because, in the movie, the character is traveling around the world, and you might want to play music from different parts of the world to help immerse you and, ground the story in that place. So you get all these different kinds of music happening back to back. So it becomes this incredible melting pot. So what's next? Well, I think we're going to start putting new things into the melting pot.
Mm-hmm. So you actually already queued me up with some audio samples.
Yes.
So I thought I would play the first one.
Yeah.
And maybe you can tell us a little bit about it as we're listening.
Yeah, so that one is by an incredible prodigy named Jacob Collier. And if you haven't checked out his stuff, you really should. He's just an incredible artist and talent. And that's actually an arrangement that he did of Pretty Young Thing, PYT. And what he does is takes a popular song and transforms it to such a great extent that it is no longer recognizable as the original song. It's become something completely different. Then he goes back to it sounding like the original song. And it's probably too much for a really mass audience, to take something that and then go really far out with it and then come back. But I think for movies, that would be perfect, to show the characters' busy life and all of the different things that are happening to them. And the music can reflect that. A multicultural world is just kind of there in that music. It just sort of accepts that, all right, we have all these different influences, and they're not really different. They just are part of my world.
Right. All right, so we have one more audio sample. Let's check this one out. You can never go wrong with prog metal, for my money.
It's kind of like prog metal, but again, he's taking it so much farther, like those guitar sounds. Mm-hmm. I haven't heard those guitar sounds before. I've heard things that wanted to be that, but never got that far out.
Right.
The technology has gotten better, so the sound can be sculpted so it's constantly morphing while the guy is playing it. And, this is a much smaller ensemble. But again, I think for like an urban drama or maybe an action movie, that this kind of stuff would be great. Instead of having an all synthesizer score for an action movie, you go to having like a prog metal band doing the music, and we kind of already had a little bit of that going back to TV with Watchmen.
That's true. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. One could, if one really wanted to go back, Flash Gordon had a soundtrack done by Queen. Not that they were industrial, but they were certainly more rock and pop for the era. And they did a soundtrack, not just putting songs against the movie.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's something I see continuing to happen. And yeah, in some ways it's a tradition or a blueprint, but there's so many ways that you can go with it. Like, Queen is all vocals or mostly vocals with some guitar. And this is all guitar. And that's another thing I can see happening in the future is more vocal, more use of voice in soundtracks. That's kind of been reserved for pop songs or, the angelic choir. The voices have been there, but in very specific roles.
And that wasn't the only movie that Queen did a soundtrack for. They also did the soundtrack for Highlander. Rest in peace, Sean Connery.
Yeah, I had forgotten about that. Now I have to check out that.
It's one of my favorite soundtracks.
Yeah, I remember Highlander, and Sir Sean was good in that too.
Yeah, there is no necessarily, if you go look for a Highlander soundtrack, you don't find a Highlander soundtrack. What you found is Queen's "It's a Kind of Magic" album.
Oh, so they rebranded it.
Mm-hmm. It was, I don't know that there was ever, and I haven't, it just before, 20 some years ago, when I was looking for soundtracks, I could not find a Highlander soundtrack because the Highlander soundtrack was the album.
Interesting.
Now, whether or not there's a score out there, I think I probably looked for a score as well and just didn't find one. But if you look for "It's a Kind of Magic," "It's a Kind of Magic" are all of the songs in the movie Highlander.
Interesting.
Interesting indeed. Okay.
Yeah.
There's also a Highlander with a soundtrack by Michael Kamen.
So he may have done the score. I mean, I've seen the movie a few times, but I don't honestly remember.
Oh, I do.
Enough about the music to know definitively one way or another. So I think the bottom line is it's safe to say that entertainment, and specifically genre entertainment, will survive this current moment in time, and that the future is bright.
If anything, I think it's actually getting more unique and more varied, and it seems like instead of just being a science fiction show or a science fiction movie, it's a drama or a comedy that just has that science fiction or fantasy elements.
Yeah,
I think it's been taken more seriously.
Yeah, Kevin Feige said that about the Marvel movies, that no longer are they just superhero movies, that they're making a political thriller, they're making a science fiction movie, they're making a heist movie, and they just happen to include their superhero characters as the protagonists.
Right. Well, they've really been doing that for a long time. Probably since the first Captain America movie, where they made a World War II movie that just happened to have a superhero in it.
The future looks bright. Well,
it does.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Darcy. Thank you, Oren, so much. This is always fun. And, we're doing this on Halloween. I just have to mention that right before we recorded this podcast, I was on a Zoom Halloween concert. And there's all kinds of creative things that people were doing for Halloween music. So
excellent.
So there's lots of creativity happening now.
There are some people that were so sad that they don't get to go to Disneyland for Haunted Holiday that they recreated it in their front yard.
Yes.
Nice.
It's funny that you said that, because the guy who was the music director for Disneyland was one of the guests, and he told us stories about creating, the Haunted Holiday at Disneyland, and he mentioned that the original ones were less scary, so there was a move to try and make them more scary. And at one point, they had a bloody headless horseman riding down Main Street, and at that point, to heavy metal rock that was being played live. And at that point,
was he running after a guy named Ichabod?
Yeah.
Yes. At that point, they got pulled back.
Okay. Well, you have to go far. You have to go a little too far to know where the limits are, and then pull back. So if we're talking about the dates, I think I do want to bring up one thing. This is going to be posted on November 1st, and to our American audience, you may have heard that November 3rd is a pretty important election. Now, this is not a political podcast. We don't tell you who to vote for, what to think,
it
or anything
doesn't mean
like that.
that we don't want you to still just go out and vote.
Right.
Make sure that your voice is heard.
Vote. Right. It's your freedom.
Exactly. That's the one thing I do want to say, is that this is a unique election in the sense that I can't remember any election in the United States in my lifetime where the administration has actively been involved in trying to undermine the legitimacy of the election and of voting and of voters. And the only way that we have to counter that is to vote. And we really need to vote to keep our country a democracy.
Yeah.
And
democracy is ruled by the people. And as Abraham Lincoln said, the mastery of the Congress and the courts belongs rightfully to the people. We are supposed to have the say.
Exactly. And so if you've already voted in the United States, thank you. We are all in this together. If you haven't voted yet, you still have time. Learn about who's running, and not just, of course, the big president, whatever. The judges, your local city councilman, who's running for mayor, the propositions. There's so many things that we get to decide in a democracy.
And at this late date, make sure that if you have a ballot that you are absentee or mail-in ballot, don't put it in the mail. Make sure it gets into a drop box.
Yes.
Or go in person and hand it in.
Yeah. It's a sad statement that the election has been so undermined. We have to make that clear. But we do have to make that clear. I know that other people around the world are looking at the United States like, what's going on, guys? Why is it so hard for you to vote? But that is the reality that we're in, and it's imperative that every single one of us who can finds a way to vote. So please vote. And thank you all for the conversation, David and Golden, and thank you, audience, for listening.
We love
you
all.
Had a
Thank
happy
you.
and safe Halloween.
And a happy All Saints Day and a wonderful year.
And I hope that this week coming up is bright and cheerful and peaceful.
Absolutely.
Oh, and if you're into looking at the sky, you're going to look at a blue moon and Mars and Venus and Jupiter and Saturn. They're all visible.
Excellent. Very nice. Thank you, everybody. And that's it for this episode. You can find the show notes at theomegabeam.com/100. If you like this episode, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Those reviews help people who like this stuff find our podcast. And I would like to take just a quick second to thank each and every one of you for listening, for choosing to spend your time listening to us. There's a lot of media out there competing for your attention, and we are humbled and grateful that you've chosen to spend some of that time with us. We're going to keep doing our best to keep you engaged. So if you have any comments or suggestions, please do drop us a line at info@theomegabeam.com. Be good to yourselves and each other, and we'll catch you next time.
The Omega Beam. Full stop.